Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome here if you're new. I hope you had a wonderful holiday and a great start to your new year. I am starting this first video of 2021 with a tutorial on my rose template number 2. Number 2 just because it's the second rose template I've released. So this template is made to be super easy. I'm taking a lot of the guesswork into how to place the petals, how to size them. All of that's gone, and what you have is this rose here. I really like this rose. I tend to just stick with one style, and so this is my new favorite just because it's so easy to make. So just to talk a little bit about it, here I have 3 sizes. So this one is 8 inches wide, this one is 5 inches wide, and I believe this one's about 4 inches wide. If you're using 8.5 by 11 size cardstock, this is about as wide as you can go, unless you are using a cutting machine and you have 12 by 12 paper that can go a little bit wider. This is as big as you can get, but I think that this is a great size, and it also uses just 6 pieces of paper for this. I believe this you can use about 2 pieces of paper, and this one's about 3 pieces of paper. So I am still making them in a way that it sort of minimizes the amount of paper. It's super easy, and there is less guesswork in sizing and just sort of placement of petals. So just all to say that I really like this new template here. So the new pattern here is just one size, and you're using 6 pieces. So I here have 1, and I'm going to count just to show you. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here, this is a 5.5 inch wide petal. So this is 5.5 inches wide this way. And the thing is that you just need 6 petals of any size. So if you wanted to do a random size, you wanted to cut your petals out 3.5 inches wide, or even just 4.39, for whatever reason, all you need is 6 petals of the same size, and it'll work since the technique is the same throughout making the entire rose. So just to reiterate, I have 5.5 inch wide petals, and here I am using this pink cardstock that has a slight sheen. So I'm going to be aware of what side I am using, but in general, if you're just using a plain cardstock that's the same color on both sides, you don't have to worry about which side you're using and which side faces up. But I will kind of talk about that as I'm going through, because I'm using a cardstock that has a matte side and a shiny side. So to start, all you need to really do is just curl your petals. I have a bone folder here. This is just what I use. So I'm going to start with splitting my petals into 2 piles of 3. I'm only doing this again because one side of this paper has a sheen and the other side doesn't. You will not have to do this if you don't have a paper like this. You'll just curl them all the same way. So because I'm splitting, I'm going to do one side where I just curled each petal in each piece. So I'm going to call this whole thing a piece, and then these are the petals. So there's 6 petals per layer, or 6 petals per piece. And I'm going to just curl the edges on each petal here. If you're using a rod or any sort of pen or dowel, this will go pretty easy. I just like to use a bone folder. So you're going to go ahead and just curl the edges like that. And then you'll do that for all of your petals. If you're using, like me, something with a shine, I did the side that has just the matte side, and then now I'm going to do the side that has the shine. So to start, I'm going to take 2 petals that are opposite from each other. It really doesn't matter which, as you can see. It's just because there's an even number, there's always going to be one directly across. So I'm going to take 2 pieces, and then I'm going to bring it together like that to create that rosebud. And I must pause here. What I want to do is, as I'm pulling these petals up, I want to make sure that, you can see there's a circle at this base here. I want to make sure that the petals are sort of folded where that circle is. I don't want the petals to go, let's say for instance like that. As you can see, there's a little bit of that petal sticking out. I don't want that, and I want to avoid that. That will mess up the shaping of your rose later on. So one thing to sort of prevent that, if you want, is you could just bend the petals here. That'll help get you started. So that is something you can do After a while, once you make a few of these roses, you kind of get better at it and you don't have to do that, but just to start, that's an easy way to make sure that when all your petals are put together, you see that there's that circle base as best as possible. So that's what we're aiming for. Okay, so I'm going to take 2 petals together and then I'm going to bring it together. So what I did was I'm sort of folding one into each other like that. And then I'm pushing it together so that I create sort of a triangle and a little peak at the top. I'm going to hold this and then I'm going to add just a little bit of glue and hold. And you want to make sure that it does have enough time to dry, because if it doesn't, or you don't give it enough time to cool down and get tacky, it will fall apart. So now I'm going to do that for the other flap here. Again, I'm going to double check that I have got the petal where I wanted to. That looks good. So then I just move on to these other petals. And so it doesn't matter which. Essentially, I'll just bring them in together like that to start creating that rosebud. You can do it 2 at a time like this, or you could just take 1 petal at a time and glue that towards the center. In terms of shaping, you will want just a little bit of space, so you don't want it to sit completely flat. Like if I bring this petal here, you don't want it just to sit flat. You want to make sure that you back off just a little bit so it creates sort of a space right here, and it creates sort of the layers or the folds of the petals. You want to do that with your other petals as well. Okay, so that is my first piece done. And just really quick, because I had the matte side down, you can see that when I brought it up, the part that shows on top is the sheen or the shiny side. So that's why I have these to start, because I want that shiny side to show up on top. So then the next thing is just to add the next petal. So at this point, I don't really care where I'm adding the petal. It will matter later on. But what I like to do is I like to add glue to the base here. I take this second petal and then I flip it over and I make sure that I have it lined up with the base. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is sometimes you could take the base, you add the glue, and then you just plop it right on. You may accidentally glue it too much to one side or another, and that will create a problem later on. It'll mess up the shaping of your petals. So this way, when you just flip it upside down and put it on top, I can see that I fit this center portion directly over this base. So everything is in line. You want to keep it nice and neat and actually lined up, because this will keep it easier as you're going on later on, or as you're making the rose with other layers. So from here, I'm just doing the same exact thing. I take any petal. For the first petal, I'm only going to glue one side here, and I'm going to bring it towards the center. But again, as I'm building more and more pieces together and more layers, I want to create space. So what I mean is we could just have it sit flat against a rosebud. I want to avoid that as much as I can and add space by leaving a portion right there like that. But for the first petal, I left one side unglued because later on I'm going to tuck this last petal in. But because I started on the left side, I'm going to go counterclockwise. But if you had glued the right side, you would just go clockwise fashion around the rose. So again, because I did the left side, I'm going to go ahead and go in a counterclockwise fashion in gluing all of these petals. So the next one then would be this one here to the left of where I glued. I'm just going to add a little glue to each side of the petal and then bring it towards that rosebud and then hold it there. And again, I am creating space. So that's what helps you get those nice, beautiful layers as you're building out this rose. I do want to stress that you want to give it enough time to cool down the glue so that you can move on appropriately. Sometimes if you're going a little too fast, and I've done this myself, if you're going a little too fast, what happens is this slides out and then you ruin the shape that you're trying to build. So again, building space, I'm leaving just a little portion here open as I'm going. It doesn't have to be too much. I would just say just a little bit so that it looks natural. Because there are 6 layers in total. So this petal here, it's not quite the last one left, but I did have to tuck it under that first petal that I did not glue down. You'll just want to make sure that you tuck it underneath. And for this very last petal here, I'm going to hold that flap that was not glued down and then tuck this one underneath. Glue that there. And then finally, glue down that last flap. So I left it unglued because I wanted to be able to tuck the petals before it underneath, but now everything is glued down. As you can see, we're starting to get a wider and wider rose. We're going to build it out more. So I was going a little too fast. You can see that right here I have a little bit of an excess, or maybe it's not so, well, I'm going to point it out. It may not be as easy to see on camera, but there's a little bit of excess. I didn't pull the petal up enough. But that's okay. You can just press down and it helps keep the shape of your base. So again, now I have this circle. What I'm going to do is add glue to the bottom. I'm going to take my last petal that has the matte side up, flip it over, and I'm going to center it along this base. So that way you can get as even as possible in the center. If I had glued it too much to one side, for instance, if I glued it too much to the right side, this petal here would actually come up a little too short as I'm trying to glue it. So when you try to center it as best as you can, it keeps it nice and even, and then all the layers are roughly the same height. So that's kind of the goal. That's why I keep repeating myself in that way. It becomes natural once you do a couple of these. But this last layer, the third layer, is just the same process as before. I'm going to just glue one side of the first petal. So I'm just going to glue this first petal like this and then go into a counterclockwise fashion as I did in the previous layer. So up until this part, it's actually fairly easy. Again, reminder, keep space here. And one way to remember that is as you add glue, you're bending the petals sort of together and then bringing it forward. And that kind of creates a little triangle, so you know not to just glue it completely flat down towards the rosebud. So a little bit of glue, and I'm just bringing it forward and then leaving that space there. It's kind of like if you take your hand and then you're just putting it there, you're not pushing it flat. I don't know if that was a great analogy. But if you're having trouble with this as you're making your roses, before you add glue, just kind of practice how you would do that. Because my petals are slightly curled like this, it kind of naturally has that sort of triangle or tent spacing here. So that helps when you have the petals glued there. And from here, you would just glue the very last petal, again tucking it underneath that very first petal where we left that flap open. So we're gonna hold that back, tuck it underneath, allow that to cool, and then just glue down the very last flap. And because it's just one entire piece, I haven't had to worry about where the placement of the petals should go. So in my previous rows, you have to glue each individual petal to the bud that we're building, and then sometimes you can go a little too short or too much, and it was a little difficult in that way because you had to guess where the petals go. So I always like to look how I'm doing with the base, and I am veering off just a little bit. I'm not sure if that can be seen, but as long as I try to keep that to a minimum, it should be fine. So now I have my second set of petals. So this is with the sheen side up. what I'm going to do, I'm just going to flip it over. Now I have the matte side here, and the petals are cupped in a downward fashion. So here they're cupped facing up. So each petal faces up, so these sides face up. Here I want it to face down, so whether or not you're using a paper with a sheen on one side, you want to keep it so that the petals here are now facing down. So I just want to make sure it's all facing down. So what I want to do again is just take the base, add glue. And so however I glue it, I want the petals to be facing down. Because I generally advise to glue it this way, like to the base, to make sure you have the right amount of spacing. So I did that again, I just added it here. When I flip it over, the petals will still be facing down. So it's a little confusing because I'm using a cardstock now with a little bit of sheen, and I have to be aware of what side I'm using. But as you're doing this, just make sure that as you're doing the second group of petals, the last 3 petals, you want the petals to be facing down. Now if you accidentally glue it so that the petals are facing up, you just flip it over and just make sure that you curl the petals so that they're facing down. This just makes it easier later on. So if you make a mistake, you can always fix that. Just to talk about a little bit, to be a little more conceptual so you can realize what you're doing as you're making this, I think that will make it easier so you know why you're doing what you're doing. The reason why I want the petals to be facing down is because now I'm going to be shaping the petals so that they flare out a little bit and you get the layers right here that I think they usually call them guard petals. So they're going to flare out a little more. It's going to give you that shape of the rose. It's going to give you that width without adding too many layers. And so what I always say is I'm going to call it my finger technique. It's not really a technique, but it's just the way that I make my roses that I find foolproof. So I take my middle finger and my thumb and I stick that underneath the petal. So this works whether the petal is very tiny or if it's a larger petal. You stick those underneath the petal and then you have your index finger on top. So the 2 fingers underneath and then the index finger on top. So I'm going to be pressing down with my index finger and pressing up with the 2 fingers underneath. And what that does, it creates a sort of shape here that when I bring it towards the rosebud, it gives me sort of that tent shape. It allows the petal to flare out a little bit here. That's that curl that we added to it. And then it gives us a nice amount of space so that we can start shaping our rose. So that way I find it very easy to just glue and then add the petals and then keep moving. I don't have to figure out too much about the shaping. So I'm going to add glue, just a little bit on each side. Stick my fingers underneath, 1 finger on top, and then I'm going to press down while my bottom fingers press up. It creates sort of like a cupped shape, again like that tent, and then I'm bringing it towards, and then here I have a nice space. It looks more like a triangle. It's more of a peaked triangle, if I would say. And because it's just the 4th layer, we don't have to worry about it flaring out too much like here in these petals. We're going to add those with the subsequent layers to follow. And it also creates a little ridge here, which is what I like. Okay, so now moving on, I'm just going to do this for all of the petals. So again, 2 fingers underneath, 1 finger on top. I'm pressing and then bringing that forward. And here, it's critical that you do wait until the glue has dried enough or cooled down enough because you don't want to lose that shaping that you're building. So sometimes you may have just to add a little more glue. So what I'm doing is each petal is bending sort of right in the center because of the way that I'm shaping it with my fingers. It creates a ridge here, so later on as you add more petals you can glue the edges of the petals here, so it makes it really easy to glue your other petals layer on too. So I'm just going to keep going. Okay, and now we're on our very last petal. So what I did before with the previous layers where I had just only glued one side of the first petal and then tucked it underneath at the end later on to get a nice round, I don't really do that as I'm making these layers, but you could if you'd like to continue doing that. I just don't find it necessary. So I just glue the very last petal. I'm gonna wait for that to dry, and then basically I'm doing the same exact thing with the last two layers. Okay, with the last two layers, this is where I'm going to be concerned about where I place these petals. So not only do I want it to fit sort of right in the center of where the base is, I want to be sure that I'm gluing this layer here in between the petals of the previous layer. So I just want to make sure that this petal is sort of in between these two petals here. So for these last two layers, I do want to make sure that these petals fall in between the petals from the previous layer. So that's just one more thing to note. But again, if you mess up, just pull it off and then stick it back on. So again, I'm just going to pick a petal to start with. You can add a little more glue if that helps. Stick the petals. So here, the ridges from the previous layer help me in where I want to glue the next petal. So again, here I'm adding space and I'm making sure that the edges of the petals sort of fit where those ridges are from the previous petal. And as you can see, it's starting to flare out just a little bit more. So now the process is just actually gluing all these petals. It's really just straightforward from here. Again, I'm still doing the finger underneath, bringing it forward. So again, I'm repeating myself, but as you bring the petal forward, you sort of bend it and it creates that ridge. That's important for later. So make sure you try to keep some little ridge right there. If you accidentally just go too flat, say for instance like that, there's no space there and there's really no ridge that's created. You can just gently pull the petal off if you've already glued it and just try again. And I want to know, I like to hold it with my thumb in the center here. That way I can grip it, but try not to press too hard. So as I'm putting these last two layers on, I'll just sort of talk a little bit more about the rose template itself. So generally, I am going to release a PDF, so this will be available in my shop very, very soon. And I am going to add a PDF, but the PDF will only have certain sizing. So basically, it'll have maybe 9 petals, generally from 4 inches wide to about 8 inches wide, which is what you can print on a standard printer on 8.5 by 11 size cardstock. But if you are using a cutting machine, which those files will be available in SVG format, PNG, all the different file types, you can actually make the rose any size that you want. I touched on that a little bit before, but you can actually make them smaller as well. So I do like these roses as smaller roses. I've been making a lot of mini roses, and this was originally made to be a mini rose template, but again, you have the option of making a larger rose like in this case, or you can go as small as you'd like. And for me, the smallest I've gone is actually, I have one here. This is 2.5 inches wide, and I used 3-inch wide petals. So that is actually fairly small, and they were a little delicate to work with, but they're fairly easy. It's something I do sort of when I'm watching a show with my family. I'll just work on these roses. It's something that I do with my hands while I'm doing something else. That's generally when I like to do things. So with these mini roses, it's just the same process. You just do it much smaller. You may have to take your time with it as you're first making them, and you do have to be a little careful with the glue gun, but they're so easy to make and they're tiny and I love it. And so that's something you can do. So as small as you'd like. I think 3-inch wide petals are very small itself. So this is my last layer. I just want to take a break from talking about that. My very last layer, again, I want to make sure that it fits nicely under the base. So it fits under the base and it's in between the petals from the previous layer. And as you can see, I've done a really good job with my base so far. So I'm going to peel this back. And you can see there's not a whole lot of excess. And so when you take it slow, generally you'll do really well with your spacing and everything like that with the petals. It's usually when I'm rushing through that I start getting a little sloppy, so that's something to keep in mind. So just be aware of your base. That makes your rose a little more uniform. So far I feel like everything is glued nicely and evenly and uniformly. So that is probably why I've mentioned to you probably 50 times just to be mindful of how you're gluing your petals and how your base looks. Overall, if you are being mindful of your base, you will have a flatter base, and it just makes it easier to add to any project that you're doing. So just to reiterate, I am just doing the same exact thing as I did before. I am still creating that space and flaring out the petals. I'm still gluing along the ridges of the previous petals. And I am adding a little more glue on each side of the petal because that way it grips the ridges a little bit easier on the previous petal, and then I don't have to worry about my petal coming undone. So I just add a nice little line of glue here and then bring that forward. So I've been mentioning all the reasons why I like this rose, and I promise you I'm not just selling it to you. I really do, or I really am very happy with the outcome of this rose template, because I find that every rose that I make has come out the same looking uniformly all throughout. And what I mean by that is my previous rose, if I was doing it a little too fast, I would find that some of my petals started looking a little like wonky, for lack of a better term. It would just look too rushed. So if I could spend, 20 minutes on every flower, that would be great, except that who has that time, really? But even with these, no matter how fast or slow I'm doing it, generally they do come out the same. So it's more forgiving when you're more patient and you're doing it nice and slow. But even the ones that I make a little rushed, they do come out the same because, again, there's a little guesswork. Part of the problem was in my previous rose, if I wasn't paying attention to where I'm gluing it, by the time I finished the rose, it would look maybe a little too compact on one side, but then perfectly fine on the other side of the rose, because I had to figure out where to glue it. For this, all you need to do is just add glue and bring it up. It's all attached in one piece. And that just makes it so much easier. So this rose looks like this rose, which looks like this rose, which looks like that rose. And I love it. And that's, one of the biggest things is that I want to save time. I want to save money with paper. I want a great outcome, but I still want all those things. So I feel like I've achieved it with this rose. And I think just from here on out, I'm going to be playing with designs rather than technique. And so I finished the rose, as you can tell. I'm just continue talking. But this is the same exact size as this one here. And you can see they're almost identical, except for maybe small details if you were really that nitpicky. But they all come out the same, which is, again, the reason why I like it, because this is what I want. I want them to look nice, I want them to look the same, and I want less work. So I do have a little pile of roses here that I've made, and this is something that I'm going to use for a project that I'm working on, which I will probably feature on a studio vlog. But you can see these are all the same. Actually, there's really only two sizes, and they all look the same. So as you can see, whether you're making an 8-inch wide rose or even just a 2.5-inch wide rose, they all look the same. And so this is something I think works really well for any project that you have. I have some ideas planned for things that I'm going to do with this rose. I purposely went really slow in this video. I get a lot of comments like you talk too much, and I do that anyway. But so I just wanted to show, especially if you're new to my channel, that if you're a beginner and you want to make these roses, there's a way to make them that it's super easy. I hope my tutorial helped with some of the techniques that I'm doing to make these roses to help take some of that guesswork out. Generally, your first rose may look a little wonky if you're doing it for the first time, but I think the results come out really nicely. So that is my rose template number 2. I'm so grateful for you watching. Let me know if you have any questions down below. I will have the listing to the Etsy shop down below in the description box. It should be live at the same time this tutorial goes live. Let me know if you have any plans for this year. I know the pandemic has put a damper on everything, but I don't think that it can stop you from, doing things that still make you happy. Maybe there's just different things. Let me know if you're making paper flowers to decorate your home or even just celebrate the little things. I have a ton of plans that I want to share with you. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.